great to see all of you. I'm really excited. This is a big moment for me. As I've joked, it's me coming out of the UFO ET geek closet and kind of sharing my passion with everyone. And I've been really, surprised pleasantly at how well received this new adventure has been by so many friends and colleagues, especially folks in the integral community, and how much people have been excited to see this conversation occurring in the integral space. So it feels like it's a conversation whose time has come, and hopefully I can contribute to us engaging in a way that expands our minds, opens our hearts, and keeps us grounded in our bodies, because some of this stuff is so far out, so crazy that it's easy to kind of get lost in all of it. So my name's Sean Aspian Hargens, for those of you who are just meeting me for the first time. And I'm married with two girls, a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and who just had their first day of school. So we just got back from picking them up. I live in Sebastopol, California, which is about an hour and 20 minutes north of San Francisco. So I'm on the West Coast. I'm the founder of Meta Integral, which is how many of you know me, which simply put is a leadership and business consulting firm based on integral principles and with a primary focus on what we call the Meta Impact Framework. And this is the model of 10 capitals that Claudia was just in Iceland representing and presenting. And you can learn more about that at our website, www.metaintegral.com. I think maybe the best thing to say about myself is in this moment is just that I'm very passionate about meta integration, which I think is why I ended up naming my company Meta Integral, because I just love knowledge. I love the integral framework. I love big pictures. And, so all of my main projects, professional and personal projects over the last 10, 15, even 20 years, I guess now, you can see the gray in my beard a little bit, that I just love trying to bring it all together and doing it in a way that's embodied and really kind of challenges us to think integratively, to live in an integral way. And so, the launching of Exo Studies is kind of my latest project in that context, along with a website that Tom Kern and I are doing called What's Up with UFOs, but I'll say a little bit more about that later and maybe have you share a little bit about that when we get to that point. So my PhD, just to give a little background on my kind of academic context, my PhD is in the philosophy of science with an emphasis on conscious studies and cosmology, and all of that was in an integral context, focusing on integral theory. So all of that's quite perfect for this topic of exo studies. And it's one of those things where when you look back on your life and you kind of see how perfect the pieces all fit together, there's a way in which, as I started realizing that I was going down this rabbit hole, that I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of parts of my life that actually just were pointing this direction, even though I hadn't yet got there myself. I've always been interested in UFOs, ETs, the paranormal, spirituality, which is what drew me to integral theory in the beginning. Was just it has such a robust model of interiority and consciousness and, just the mystery of reality, that I just felt it was, as many of us do, one of the best maps around. Though I've always, complained that integral theory hasn't done a good job of including the subtle realms. And, Michael Zimmerman and Stuart Davis and I had a recent conversation, which some of you might have seen, that we posted online, talking about the ontological status of subtle beings and what can we and can't we say, and kind of starting to open up that conversation, which in many ways, this call and this course is kind of a continuation of that inquiry. And so I feel like integral theory provides a lot, but there's a way in which there's a few areas that still need to be colored in. And I think the exo studies piece is one of those, as we'll explore today. I've had some of my own multidimensional experiences that have put me in touch with the wild reality that we find ourselves in, and what many call the multiverse. And as I, kind of grappled with those experiences and made sense of those and shared those with others, it just kept leading me down this path, right? So it's like the more I went into the depths of my own spiritual practice and working with the contents and the experiences that came out of that, it just kept taking me into a galactic kind of frame. And it was ironic and paradoxical because in a way, a lot of my practices have been about going, really into the natural world and ecology and nature. But there was something about kind of going deep into Gaia, which kept taking me out into the galactic space beyond Gaia. And so that's been a wild and crazy process. And maybe I'll say more about that in the course at different points. I've read a lot of the UFO ET literature, and the more that I read, the more I realized that it was so multifaceted that anything less than a meta view and anything less than an integral view just was going to end up leaving out too many important elements. And as with many domains, I saw a lot of what Ken Wilber would call kind of quadrant absolutisms, with different camps, kind of claiming their piece of the UFO story, and then poo-pooing everyone else. And I just kept thinking, like, this is crazy. Like, this is such a complex topic. It's like, everyone's got a key insight here. So like, let's find a way to like kind of bring in all the insights. And so similar to what I did with integral ecology, where I kind of identified, along with Michael Zimmerman, the 200 plus kind of schools of ecology and environmental thinking. I started kind of doing that same thing with, the UFO stuff, right? Though the UFO stuff is much weirder than the ecology stuff. So it's taken me a little longer to kind of get my hands around it. And I still don't think I've totally done that, but I feel like I have enough of a handle to be a guide of sorts for all of us in the course. And one area that I'm really interested in is the cultural shadow dynamics that have made this, what I like to say, the most discredited, credible topic on the planet. And I feel like the cultural taboo around it actually is I think of it as a kind of a piece of evidence of the truthfulness of the topic. So literally about a year ago, Stuart Davis reached out to me because he had had some wild experiences with a mantis being, which is available on YouTube with kind of an audio documentary that he put together called Man Meets Mantis. And Stuart had heard through the grapevine that I too was kind of exploring some of these, choppy waters and had had some of my own experiences. So he reached out to me because he and I were, integral kids back in the day, sitting at Ken Wilber's feet and listening to, exemplars like Michael Zimmerman at the, early II Integral Institute meetings. So Stuart and I go back 20 years. And so, I was in Ireland, he was in Boulder, and we had a series of, Zoom calls kind of comparing notes. And it really felt kind of like soul brothers kind of sharing these deep experiences and kind of the questions that they bring up. And it was in that process of kind of connecting with Stuart on a deep heart level that I really got in touch with my soul impulse to be more open and public about this topic and trying to bring a little integral sanity to it. And so I really credit Stuart as kind of the inspiration to kind of push me across the threshold and decide to launch what I call the Institute of Exostudies and create the website and to announce this course. And I announced the course in November once the website was ready, and then connected with Michael Zimmerman, who I had forgotten had written several articles on the abduction phenomenon back in the 90s, I think it was, and had worked with John Mack for many years. And then Jeff Salzman reached out to me and said, this is a topic I tend to stay away from, but if you're talking about it, I want to pick your brain. And so he had me on the Daily Evolver. And many of you signed up for the course after that interview. And then Michael Garfield, who's a dear friend and student from the JFK days, had me on his podcast, Future Fossils. And then Stuart and Michael and I decided to do that video conversation around subtle beings. So it's just built momentum. And then Tom Curran, who was the second person to sign up for the course, he and I, had a few Zoom conversations about the course and just, the readings, because he was diving into everything. And then we realized that we wanted to collaborate on an additional project, which we'll share more about later. So this thing is just really kind of like a train, taking off the station. It's heading down the tracks, and who knows where it's going for me, but I'm excited to be on it, and I'm glad you all are joining me for this call, and also many of you for the course. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a context and a feel for me and kind of how I've ended up here. Let me say a little bit about the call and our time together. So this is the first video call for the ExoStudies Master Course. And, ExoStudies, as I'll be explaining, I'm proposing a new integrative meta field that draws on dozens of disciplines to help shed light on this complex and mysterious phenomenon that often just gets labeled the UFO, ET, kind of situation. And so this first call, even though it's the first call for the people who have signed up for the course, it's also open to the public, so that people who are interested but not sure if this is, a good use of their time and energy can kind of check it out, get an overview of the course, get a sense of me and who else is involved, and and then sign up over the next few days or next week, because we're starting in with our first set of readings and engagements, and I'll be sending out a video lecture on Monday. And so the course is taking off. This is the beginning of it, but it felt appropriate to have the first call kind of be more open one. So I sent out announcements to my network and so forth. I mentioned the call is being recorded. And in this first video call, I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking. But in the remaining video calls that happen weekly, they're going to be discussion driven. And, and that's why I'll be sending out the video lecture, which will be about 20 minutes each week at the beginning of the week, so that I can kind of put all of my talking points in that. And then when we have our 1 hour conversations, either on Tuesdays or Thursdays, then we can just dive into discussion, and all of you can do most of the talking. And then we'll have the Slack channel and space for, conversation and threaded discussions. And just so people understand, there's 2 1 hour calls each week, Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific and Thursday at 5 p.m. And members of the course can attend one or both of those, and they will both be recorded and posted. I wanted to increase the likelihood that people could attend the call, so I thought I would, instead of having a longer 2 hour chunk, I would break it into 2 1 hour chunks on, one in the morning, for people in Europe and, in similar time zones. And then, one later in the afternoon, for people in Australia and similar time zones, to try and, kind of make it more accessible to folks. So the agenda today is for me to kind of give like a 60-minute lecture of sorts, and then do Q&A for a half hour, and then give an overview of the course, and just kind of get into the syllabus, as it were. And as I talk, you can put questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them during the call, or I'll respond to them in Slack in the course. Or if you're not in the course, I'll for some of them, I might try and track down your email and respond to you that way. All right, so I want to start with our galactic context, right? I want to, start really big, because we are living in an amazing moment. It's just, and I've been watching this for the last 5 or so years, and it's just getting more and more cool, right? So since 1995, 25 years ago, 4,000 exoplanets have been discovered, right? And so these are planets outside of our solar system, and there's a number of different types of them, and we won't go into that now. And there's new ones being discovered almost every week. When I made the syllabus, about a year ago, it was like 3,800 exoplanets had been identified at that point. So we've already had over 200, more discovered, in the last year. And just to give you an idea of kind of the news cycle, right? One day ago, there's an article with the following headline: "Exoplanet unlike any other." And it basically describes an exoplanet that has this very odd elliptical orbit, quite different than anything we've seen before. 2 days ago, there was a headline: "3 rocky exoplanets just 12 light years away," which is considered to be pretty close. Those are our neighbors. and then 3 days ago, and over kind of the last week, there was some research that came out that a number of articles have been based on. And 2 of the headlines, just to give you a feel for that research, are: "There could be planets out there which are even more habitable than Earth." Right? So that's a pretty interesting statement. Like, we think of Earth as being pretty habitable. So like, what does it even look like to have a planet that's more habitable than Earth? And then another headline based on the same kind of research: "Alien life on some exosolar planets could be more diverse than Earth." Right? So this is cool. Like, this really gets your imagination going. Like, what the hell would all that exo biodiversity look like? Right? So there are trillions of planets, and there's over 40 billion, with a B, Earth-like planets, right? 40 billion Earth-like planets. And by Earth-like planets, we mean not just rocky with some water, but that are also in what's called the Goldilocks zone, or the habitable zone, right? Where there's a high likelihood that there would be life somewhat along the lines of what we understand life to be, right? And so there's also the possibility that there are other types of life forms that are far exceed our sense of what's possible, right? So, that remains to be seen. But, and just not too long ago, there was the TRAPPIST-1 system with 7 planets, all mostly within that Goldilocks zone, right? This caused a big commotion at the time because it was so exciting to discover that. So we're also on the likelihood of discovering microbial life either on Mars or the various moons around Saturn and Jupiter, right? We've discovered water on all those places. We have discovered methane on Mars. So there's just a lot happening. So it's, we're likely going to discover microbial life in our own solar system within the next 5 to 10 years. And it just gets more exciting after that. And we are becoming a multi-planet species, right? With Elon Musk and, the other folks, Branson with their private space companies. We are, seriously considering what it looks like to colonize the moon and have a base on the moon. What would it look like to terraform Mars? So like, there's a level of discussion around humans going off planet that's never happened before. And that just seems to be around the corner, right? And then, as many of you know, the New York Times article on the AATIP, AATIP program, the $22 million secret UFO study program of the Pentagon, that was, shared with the rest of us in December of 2017, that really broke open a whole new level of mainstream discourse around the topic, which has, been a pretty taboo topic. Even in the last 6 months, there have been a series of articles in mainstream, news reporting in magazine and journals, and a lot of those are listed on the ExoStudies site. And you can see the source and the date and the title, and it's pretty impressive to look at that because it really signals that the winds are shifting here. More mainstream news outlets are picking up this story and talking about it. We have, the U.S. Navy announced new guidelines for reporting UFOs, which is a big deal because in the past you would be demoted and penalized for reporting such things. And there's a complex history around that, which we'll get into in the course. There's also just been the activities of To the Stars Academy, which, is connected with Tom DeLonge and, a whole group of kind of high-level folks, and then the U.S. Congress has asked for debriefings on the UFO situation. The History Channel's Unidentified series, 6-part episodes, they had like 1 million viewers. Also, the Discovery Channel has a new series out called Contact, which is also quite interesting. So over the years, various polls have been done, and consistently the public has come forward and basically said, and I mean the global public, not just the US, that about 50% or more people believe in extraterrestrial intelligent life, right? And in many comparisons, that's as much or more than the number of people who believe in God, right? So that's just a very interesting kind of cultural commentary that there's essentially as many people who believe in extraterrestrials as believe in God. And that doesn't mean those are two separate groups, because there's many people who believe in both, right? But it's just to say that it's a pretty common and viewpoint within the public that this is a high likelihood. And yet our public discourse and our institutions, academic, politically, scientifically, have really made a no-go topic, right? And so there's an interesting disconnect between the general public's embrace of this possibility and the intellectual discourse around it, and the taboo around having conversations. We also have, Bob Lazar, who, for those of you who don't know, is connected with, he came out in like the 80s, talking about Area 51, and was really kind of the person who put Area 51 on the map. And there's been a lot of controversy around him and his story. But over the years, I think it has to be said that more and more things have supported his story than have discredited him. So it feels like, his story is holding up. And, he recently did an interview, a 2-hour, I think, interview with Joe Rogan. He was a really popular kind of podcast video person. To date, in the last 2 months, has 7.5 million views, right? And so these are the things that are indicating that the winds are shifting. Like there's something happening here. We also have Luis Elizondo, who's part of the To the Stars Academy. He went on the record on Fox TV, I believe it was, or one of the news channels, saying that the U.S. government actually has debris from a UFO, or what's sometimes called metamaterial, right? And then we have Harry Reid, the retired Senate Majority Leader, also recently, I think it was in January, going on the record, also in the context of an interview on a news channel, and I think it was with George Knapp, saying that if he shared what he knew about UFOs and ETs, he would lose congressional credibility. Right. And so if you just read between the lines on that, like he's basically saying he's a believer, like if he really shared what he knew, like it would make our jaws drop. And he was one of the main people behind getting the $22 million for the Pentagon, study done, okayed, green lighted. Right. So the other thing that I think is worth mentioning, just by way of wrapping up kind of our galactic context and moment, is there are more really good books and really good documentaries and materials out there than ever before. The downside is there's a lot of crap out there too. And this is partly why Tom and I have teamed up to try and sort through that and kind of, be guides for people who are interested in this topic but don't know how to sort through the amount of material and so, but I think it is fair to say that, the quality of research, the quality of documentaries, the quality of writing is at the highest level I've ever seen. And I think that's exciting. It shows that we're starting to actually build an intellectual discourse around this in a way that I think can really serve to open up the conversation at a wider scale. Okay, so that's the galactic context. So now let me say a little bit about the UFO context. And I want to do this by, making a few talking points about the two books that I list in the syllabus, that kind of open up the program. And one is UFOs for the 21st Century Mind by Richard Dolan. And the other is UFOs Reframing the Debate, which is an edited volume by Robbie Graham. So I'm going to say a few things about these books. And oh, by the way, so here are all the books, most of the books. There's a few I couldn't find in my library yet that I've gone through and that are the, really supporting the conversation in the course over the next 4 months. I also have a library of about 200 additional books on UFOs that I'll be drawing on. And Tom and I are working through a lot of that material. It's quite a process, but it's exciting. So let me start with Dolan's book. So this came out in 2014, and it's my estimation, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that Richard Dolan is one of the most respectable UFO historians ever. And he's the author of numerous important books. Like pretty much everything he puts out is pretty worthwhile. And he tends, to be conservative. Now, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because I'm saying that within a context where, there's some pretty wild things being said and discussed, right? So some of you might read Dolan and say, what, this is conservative? But trust me, if you really read the wide range of stuff that I read, you would say, oh yeah, he's pretty conservative comparatively. And this book, I believe, is, the best single introduction and overview that I've come across. It's basically 500 pages, so it covers a lot of ground. And it begins with, kind of what are UFOs, and then looks at potential, ancient visitations, kind of the ancient aliens, kind of angle, of what are the kind of evidence we have that contact and interactions have been going on for a long, long time. He tends to poo-poo a lot of the, kind of typical moves that the ancient aliens angle presents, but he does name a number of things that do make us think that maybe this has been happening for, from the beginning. And then he follows the chronology, from the late 1800s up to modern day, right? So, and he really goes through all the key incidences and key players and situations, and, just gives a really good historical overview. Then he takes a close look at abductions and contact and how the field of ufology has evolved. Towards the end, he devotes a chapter to like, who are they, meaning the ETs and the space beings, like, what can we say about, who they are and what their motivations might be. And then he focuses at the very end on weird science, and some of the cutting edge things that are happening in that context. So this book is a really good book to bring anyone up to speed on the UFO topic, and it's a quite, a wide-ranging and well-written book. So that helps kind of give people an overview of ufology, over the last 200 plus years. Now, the next book, The Reframing the Debate, I chose because it really complements Dolan's historical volume. And this edited collection introduces you to a wide range of perspectives on the topic and introduces a number of lesser known positions around UFOs and ETs. Most of the authors are not very well known outside of UFO circles. And so they tend to be kind of newer, fresher voices, which I think is nice. And I really like the way the 14 chapters tend to go back and forth between kind of a believer perspective to a skeptic perspective. And this format, I believe, helps you, the reader, kind of find your own viewpoints within or between the presented material. And it helps underscore that many of the key debates are far from settled, right? This is the most, largest Gordian knot you can imagine, and everyone's got an opinion, and many of those opinions are quite different from each other, right? So and I found about half the chapters to be really great and the rest to just be okay. And I think that's true for most people reading anthologies. Many of the chapters don't necessarily really, aren't connect with you and kind of your own thinking. But I really like getting the broad sense of the conversations and seeing kind of what's currently happening in the field of UFO studies. Most of the key issues and debates are represented, and many of them come down to essentially the nuts and bolts types versus the consciousness paranormal types. And in integral language, this is basically the upper right, versus the upper left, right? This is behavior and science versus consciousness and experience, right? So a lot of the field of UFO studies can be divided into those two major camps. However, one of the nice things about this volume is it does introduce several chapters that challenge the UFO ET hypothesis and basically say, that there's something else going on besides, people, space beings flying around in metal craft, or people just making contact through altered states with beings in other dimensions or on other planets. That while that might be some of what's happening, that doesn't exhaust the phenomenon, and there's actually two other strong possibilities. And one of those is essentially what's called, often referred to as the psychosocial hypothesis, which is at its worst is kind of like the notion of mass hysteria. At its best, it's kind of something along the lines of Jungian archetypes and kind of collective unconscious, and how we're manifesting this phenomenon collectively in some sense. And then the other is what I call the planetary energy hypothesis, which basically looks at Earth energies and portals and the ley lines and the electronic, kind of energy grids across the planet, and how there are, different phenomena that are associated with the UFO experience that are essentially these kind of Earth lights or Earth energy dynamics. And so if you step back and you look at these four different kind of major theories, right, they essentially map onto the four quadrants. So that struck me early on. It's like, because I wasn't even looking for the four quadrants, but I basically was, associated with Ken Wilber's, work. But, when I started seeing, these four major camps being referred to over and over again, it just was obvious that here again, you have an example of a field, be it psychology or biology or ecology or, education or medicine, that basically over time has enough different positions that essentially occupy the major, kind of components of what we call the integral model or the four quadrants. So this was kind of the beginning of me thinking about like, oh, what would an integral approach to all of this look like, right? And how might we do that? So this book, I think, it kind of gives a perspectival kaleidoscope. And in fact, there's this great quote in the introduction on, I think it's page 25. It says, "I advocate for a multi-theory interpretation of the UFO phenomenon. I don't think there is any one explanation that accounts for all the data. I think there are a number of things going on simultaneously." End of quote. And this is precisely why I think we need exo studies, is because there isn't a single phenomenon. There's a lot of different things that are going on under the banner of UFO kind of ET hypothesis. And so, so I think this volume is very true to its title. I think it's successful in reframing the debate and demonstrates that we need a more integral approach to the topics. So these two books kind of help set the stage for the whole course and allow a reader in the span of two books to basically gain an overview that would normally come from reading dozens and dozens of books, right? Dolan provides the historical evolution of the phenomenon, and Graham provides kind of the AQUAL, four quadrant range of voices in the field, right? Now, participants in the course, you're not expected to read any of the books, right? I know I just showed you the big stack of all the books that are kind of part of driving the discussion. I've read those books, right? So you don't have to. The invitation to you is to, take a look at the list and then pick the ones that you're drawn to and read those, right? There's no way you can read, 200-300-page books every week and keep up with me. Like, it's taken me a year to kind of read through all of this. I'm going to be pulling out key discussion points from these books and then using them each week to kind of drive our discussion. And also kind of serving as a guide to help point each of you to the other resources that are going to really fit with your interests and kind of where you're wanting to go and explore in all of this. So I just didn't want people to freak out that they're thinking they have to read all this. Though when I taught at JFK, I did tend to assign that much reading. So I think it can be done, but you're not graduate students getting a graduate degree, so I'm not going to torture you the way I tortured my JFK students. And Giorgio can attest to that, right? So, what is exo studies? So I think our galactic context and the UFO context, as represented by these two books I just kind of gave a brief overview to, really show us that we need to go meta, and we need to go integral. And that to really understand the UFO ET phenomenon, which is much bigger than just UFOs and ETs, right? So I made that point, but I think that this is part of what drew me to the notion of kind of rebranding ufology and coming up with a name of a new integrative meta field that wasn't just reducible to the notion of UFOs and ETs. Because when you really get into this, you get into the paranormal, you get into a lot of areas that I think we need to draw on to make sense of this phenomenon. And so while there's kind of a primary focus on UFOs and ETs, exo studies really goes beyond that and really kind of takes an integral meta view of like, what else do we need to draw on in order to, understand what's going on, right? So the prefix, X, EX, or exo, EXO, it's a Greek, which basically means out of or external. So in our context, exo means typically beyond our solar system, right? And you see this in the use of exoplanets, even exotheology, exobiology, right? There's a number of kind of technical terms that use exo as the prefix. And this is essentially saying we live in a big universe, right? The other aspect of exo that I'm drawing on, so I'm using exo in two ways. One, I'm using it to point to we live in a big, mysterious universe. And then also that anomalous phenomenon challenge our conventional consensus of reality, right? So this is not that only we live in a big universe, but we actually live in a very weird universe. And there are a lot of anonymous phenomenon that just don't fit with our conventional mainstream narrative or, even our understanding of physics in a conventional sense. Though what's interesting is that actually our leading edge of physics actually is totally constant with most of everything I'm going to share today. So, but the kind of mainstream narrative around that isn't caught up with kind of the leading edge of physics, right? But physics is talking about wormholes and parallel universes, and they have a lot to say about why there probably are extraterrestrials and a lot of other interesting things. So exo, in terms of exo studies, is kind of referring to a big universe and a weird universe. Here's my working definition of exo studies. So exo studies is an emerging integrative metafield committed to exploring the psychological, sociological, and scientific implications of living in a multidimensional multiverse. This includes the first-person accounts of people having contact with or experiencing non-human intelligences. It also includes the exploration of cultural meaning-making dynamics that make this topic taboo, and considers what can foster a more galactic-centric humanity. And it explores the role that the new exosciences and cutting-edge physics have to offer our understanding of reality. So while exo studies includes what has historically fallen within the UFO ET context, it goes beyond this by taking a meta view of the dynamic interplay between mind, meaning, and matter, often drawing on source material that traditionally hasn't been connected to the study of UFOs and ETs. Hopefully that gives you, more of a technical sense of kind of what I have in mind when I'm talking about exo studies. So let me actually then, so one of the things that exo studies does, as it mentions, is it includes a lot of different fields. And so this just gives you a flavor of the different fields that I'm drawing on to inform my development of exo studies. So there's three main categories. There's the academic literature. This includes, most the kinds of disciplines you would find on a college campus. I have listed here, the ones that I have studied and been focused on. Everything from animal consciousness to, the new field of quantum mind and social ontology, feminist theory, film studies, anthropology, somatics and trauma, healing, right? So we have all these kind of conventional academic, disciplines. Then you have the UFO literature, abduction studies, astrotheology, the nuts and bolts sightings, crash retrievals, whistleblower testimony, UFO cults, the study of that, material science, and so forth, right? National security studies. And then you have what I'm calling the fringe literature, esoteric anatomy, New Age culture, the yogic traditions, astral travel studies, so out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, Fortean studies, which is based on Charles Fort, and kind of looks at the paranormal, cryptozoology, psychedelics, the missing 411 cases, Bigfoot studies. There's a lot of evidence that there's some connection between Bigfoot and UFOs. Free energy, Tesla studies, sacred geometry, Gnostic studies, even comics and graphic novels. Jeffrey Kripal has a great book called Mutants and Mystics that goes into that. Folklore, various cosmologies, and even the study of the fairy, fae, and elemental beings. And so these disciplines are the ones that I've been actively reading in for the last 10 plus years, and that I'm drawing on to support my development of this kind of meta approach to exo studies. So then what comes out of all of that, right? So one of the things that I'm really struck by is the amount of evidence that there are UFOs and that there are ETs, right? And this is, in a sense, ironic because you often hear people say there's no evidence, right? And so I could say a lot about what's going on there, and it gets into the taboo. But let me just try and give you a flavor for the kinds of evidence there is. So we have experiencers, thousands of people, credible people reporting incredible things around their direct experiences, including abductions and also, positive encounters. We have, hundreds of whistleblowers. These are, very credible people who have come forward at great risk in many cases and shared what they know, from the government or the military or private industry. We have psi research, that continues to show the relationship between mind and matter, and telepathy, for instance, because most encounters with non-human intelligences occurs telepathically in terms of communication and language. We also have the multiple contact modalities that the Free organization, the research on extraordinary, experiences and extraterrestrial contact. Giorgio is involved with them, and I'm also involved. So part of what they've pointed to, and I realize this as well in my own readings, is that people who are having out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, life between life experiences, shamanic experiences, psychedelic experiences, or sometimes just meditative experiences, people working with all of those different modalities are having encounters with ETs. They're also having encounters with other types of non-human intelligences, but ETs of various shapes and sizes and sorts do show up in the context of those altered states and those practices. And they have a lot of similarity across the reports, right? And so this starts to triangulate and confirm, when near-death experiences are sounding very similar to out-of-body experiences, which are sounding very similar to DMT experiences or ayahuasca experiences, like you start to have to, ask yourself, okay, how is it these people are encountering very similar realities and beings as a result of doing very different types of, kind of spiritual practices? We also have, astrotheology and religious studies. The Vatican has been very proactive in making it clear to Catholics that it's okay for them to believe in ETs. And so there's a lot of interesting questions that get raised around that, and why are they doing that? What do they know that's leading them to be proactive around that, and so forth? There's also, numerous Native American and indigenous cosmologies essentially, are pretty consistent in reporting that we come from star beings. And their descriptions of that are varied, but also consistent. There's also the history of government secrecy and disinformation. Over 10,000 pages of Freedom of Information Act documents that very clearly show the quote unquote machinery of secrecy around UFOs, and the black budget projects and so forth. There's also just the cultural cognitive dissonance. This is the taboo, that the shadow material of this at a collective level, that if it wasn't such a shadowy area for us, then like it probably wouldn't be as true. Like when we work with our own shadow material, it's because the shadow is we're not wanting to face the truth, right, in some sense. And so we do our own shadow work to basically integrate the truthfulness of that content. So I think something similar is going on at a collective level, and there's been some good analysis of this. Also in art, literature, and music, there is a lot of people who are basically claiming that their creativity comes primarily through contact with ETs, and that, you know, everyone from Michael Jackson to Jimi Hendrix to the Moody Blues, you know, to the Beatles. Like, I mean, it's when you really start digging into the accounts of these otherwise very famous musicians, as well as, you know, less well-known ones, and the stories that they tell or that are part of kind of their historiography, it's quite stunning. We also have, you know, the ancient alien mysteries. There's a lot of very curious archaeology and structures around the world that are just utterly unexplainable. We have the exoplanet science. We've talked a little bit about that. We just have tons of nuts and bolts evidence, you know, thousands and thousands of sightings. We have multiple witness accounts, mass sightings, you know, thousands of people, like, you know, with the Phoenix Lights, for instance, you know, in '97. We have, you know, authenticated photos and videos. We have physical evidence, trace evidence, radar returns. I mean, it just goes on and on. It's amazing how much quote unquote physical evidence there is. And then we have exophysics, the theoretical basis that essentially supports the notion of multiverses, higher dimensions, time travel, wormholes, you know, and many other kind of concepts that, you know, match very well with, you know, the UFO ET phenomenon. And then we have exopolitics. We have, you know, dozens of countries, you know, around the world going on record, releasing their UFO files, you know, their sighting files. You know, we have France, Brazil, Mexico, you know, Chile has a whole, you know, government department devoted to the study of UFOs and has been operative since '97, I believe, right? So there's a lot of governments that are much more open and forthcoming around this. You know, the U.S., you know, through the Freedom of Information Act has released a lot of stuff. The Ministry of Defense in the UK has also released a lot of stuff. You know, so there's a lot of material out there to sort through. And then we have, you know, things like the amount of UFOs sightings around nuclear establishments and, you know, submarines and so forth. We have over 100 pretty well documented crash retrievals, you know, and if even just one or two of those are legit, like, you know, that's a game changer, right? So just to summarize the kinds of evidence that is out there, and it's pretty substantial, we have psychological, religious, anthropological, hermeneutic, spiritual, esoteric, paranormal, archaeological, physical, photographic, technological, mathematical evidence, theoretical evidence, physics, consciousness studies, sociological, political, and even biological, right? So, I mean, it's just like stunning, like the amount of evidence that is out there in different ways pointing to essentially the same types of conclusions, that UFOs are real, ETs are real, and there's a very strong taboo that prevents us from talking about it as a legitimate topic of intellectual and scientific and academic and political value, right? So, you know, as I've said, I can't think of another topic that has so much evidence that's viewed as having no evidence. This paradox in itself should pull our attention to the topic, right? Right. So, you know, not surprisingly, you know, all this evidence and the various conflicting theories related to it basically falls into the four quadrants. And I shared a little bit about that. You know, so all this evidence really demands that we take an integrative approach, that we take a meta view, and that we develop a post-positivist science, a broad empiricism that can better work with this kind of evidence. Because, like, if you look at the research that NIDS, the National Discovery Institute of Science, did around the Skinwalker Ranch, right, and that they put a lot of money, I think even billions of dollars, into the research they did there, that paranormal site, for many years, you know, at least 5, maybe more. And basically they brought the best scientific instruments and methodologies to bear on trying to understand what's going on there, because there was poltergeist activity, there was Bigfoot sightings, there were other cryptoids, there was UFOs and extraterrestrial types of encounters. There were a lot of weird things happening on that ranch and in that area. And essentially it appears to be some kind of portal, right? Some kind of place where the veil between worlds is very thin and very weird things happen, right? So they threw the best of science at it, and essentially none of the phenomenon ever repeated itself other than to say it was all really weird, right? So it was hard for them to basically study it in their traditional scientific way that essentially requires a repeatable phenomenon within a laboratory context, right? So we need to develop a better post and, positivist kind of in the field style of, kind of integral science that can really work with the kind of evidence, because there's a lot of evidence. It just doesn't fit very well in kind of our more, kind of positivist, empirical, reductionistic notion of science. But that shouldn't lead us to believe that there isn't a lot of evidence. We just don't have, in my opinion, the kind of science that does a very good job of evaluating it and engaging it. The next thing I want to share is that in trying to deal with all this evidence and all these different issues, I've been developing a list of kind of what I call the meta principles to kind of help navigate this. So I'm just going to go through these because these are what I feel are some of the guiding principles for how to explore this topic. And hopefully through this course, many of you will help me refine and add to this list. But one that I start with is Jack Hunter's notion of ontological flooding. And this is a very interesting concept because it's the opposite of phenomenological notion of bracketing, which in bracketing, you basically decide to not make any assumptions about the ontological status of what you're experiencing, right? So for instance, if you're experiencing a ghost, the bracketing would say, okay, who knows if there really is a ghost there or not? We're not going to try and make a claim about that because there's no way for us to really verify that. We're just going to focus on the experience and consciousness that you're having as you're encountering the so-called ghost, right? So bracketing really kind of focuses, primarily on the kind of the epistemological, first-person experience of the phenomenon that's under investigation. And it's a very well-developed methodology, and it serves a purpose. But it also, I think, needs to be complemented by what Hunter develops, this notion of ontological flooding, which is you start from an assumption of assuming what you're encountering is real. And that you basically are kind of generous in that regard as a starting point. And then you bring different types of critical thinking to it to kind of verify and parse it down and get more clear about what is it you're really dealing with. Right, but it's you start with kind of granting some kind of ontological status to what you're dealing with, and then this goes into the next principle, which is a hermeneutics of generosity, right? Giving the benefit of doubt, right? And then this is also connected to taking multiple perspectives and really going beyond our categories. Part of what the UFO phenomena is demanding of us is we have to transcend so many of the categories that we have between subject and object, real and unreal, physical, non-physical, because the UFO phenomenon and the ET phenomenon associated with it seems to be all of the above, right? And this is what makes it so confusing and so bizarre, is that, in one moment, the UFO is a physical craft in our airspace, and in another moment, it's an energetic orb, right? In another moment, it's gone. In another moment, it turns into a space beam, right? That's standing in front of you. Like, it's just bizarre, and it just doesn't fit into so many of our categories. And so and I think this is part of why it can be a catalyst for a more integral society, because it's really going to force us to go beyond scientific, rational materialism and reductionism. It blows all of that out of the water. And Derrida, Jacques Derrida, right, the famous postmodern deconstructionist, has this great notion called undecidable, right? So the UFO phenomenon is undecidable, meaning it is neither one thing or the other, but is somehow both, right? So it's not an objective phenomenon or subjective phenomenon, it's both. It's, we can extend that to the four quadrants. It's simultaneously intersubjective, interobjective, subjective and objective. It's neither any of those, and it's all four of those things, right? And so that's part of what makes it so frustrating for researchers, because it's hard for them to compare notes, because one set of researchers is focused on the objective dimensions of it, and the others are focused on the subjective dimension. And then they want to reduce it to that, often in many cases. So we have to acknowledge the multivalent nature of it. Reality is weird. If the UFO ET phenomena shows us anything, it shows us it's weird. And we need a broad empiricism, a la, Ken Wilber, to really start to kind of get our hands and heads around it. We need also a lot of epistemic reflexivity. We need to really reflect on ourselves, our blind spots, our preferences, our structures of consciousness, levels and types, and all of that. We need to model a high level of epistemic reflexivity as researchers ourselves in this context. And we need to do a lot of shadow hunting, right? The UFO phenomenon is driven by a lot of, egos, partial viewpoints, shadow material of the respective peoples involved with that. And this is true, in any, set of disciplines, but I think it gets amplified in the UFO ET realm for a number of reasons. And I won't go into that now, but I think we all can imagine what some of that might be. And we have to take witnesses seriously. Like, they are one of the core, entry points to this phenomenon. And so often witnesses are degraded, and not taken seriously. And so I think we really have to do a better job. And it doesn't mean they don't have, cognitive biases, memory issues. Like, there are a lot of challenges with witness testimony, but there is so much of it, and it's so consistent and varied in the way that you would expect it to be if it was truthful, right? So we really have to develop a better way of working with that content. And we need to play nice, and there's no need to put others down, right? I think this is the thing I love about Richard Dolan. At the end of many of his kind of podcasts and video interviews, he really reminds all of his listeners, like, let's be good to each other. Like, let's keep trying to take the high ground. Let's, this is a complex topic. Let's not, get nasty with one another. Let's keep the playing, the fighting fair, so to speak. And I think that's really true. And we need to have constructive criticism, and we need to develop our own subtle senses, our own capacity for multidimensional awareness, because many of these phenomena are beyond our five senses. And so as spiritual practitioners, of esoteric practitioners, there's a lot for us to do to cultivate our own embodied consciousness so that we can perceive and experience these domains in a direct fashion. And there's a lot of material out there about how we might do that. And so I feel like this really needs to be part of the equation. There's also this notion from Charles Fort about damned facts, right? These facts that don't fit into kind of our mainstream narrative. And this notion of intermediatism, kind of an awkward word, but what he's pointing to with it is that reality exists on a continuum. And one way that this gets described is that nothing is real, but nothing is not real, right? All phenomena are approximations between realness and unrealness. And so there's this ontological indeterminacy, right? And so I think this is partly why we actually have to cultivate more of an integral worldview, or a teal and turquoise worldview, for those of you familiar with that language. Is because it's ambiguous, it's complex, it's volatile, it's VUCA, right? To use that acronym, right? It's a very complex, mysterious, elusive phenomenon, and there is epistemic indeterminacy, and there's ontological indeterminacy, and so it makes it hard to study it. And I also try and draw on the best of Wilber, Roy Bhaskar, and Edgar Morin's work, right? Let me now share with you a set of claims that I like to call the 18 non-controversial, controversial meta-claims of exostudies, right? And so the reason that for most people, all of these claims would be controversial. The reason I'm calling them non-controversial is because I believe, when you really dive into the literature and the material, and you take the red pill, so to speak, right? you get on the other side, and you're like saying to yourself, okay, there's something to all this, that these claims start to become obvious, like in some sense. That doesn't mean you have to agree with me on all these. And I even sometimes question whether I believe all of them all the time. But at any rate, they're I think, a powerful, provocative starting point about, what might we say, if we take some orienting generalizations, to use Wilber's language, like if you, read the top 500 books, and in this area, and watch, thousands of hours of videos and testimonies, like what would be some of the conclusions that you would likely come to? And so here's my first stab at this. First, too many credible people are saying incredible things, right? It's unbelievable. The literally millions of people who fall into this, right? The second thing is then we are not alone, right? And that there are actually multiple galactic races. Often in the ET literature, you kind of get the impression that there's between 2 and 5. It appears that there's dozens, if not hundreds, of different galactic races. And they all seem to have their own agendas. They overlap, but there's good ETs and bad ETs, basically, and neutral ETs, just as there are people. And they also exist on a spectrum of matter, right? From being physical beings to being etheric or energetic or pure light beings, right? And many of them can move between those different phases. They transcend, they being both the UFOs and the ETs, transcend our subject-object categories. They've been interacting with us for a very long time. We have recovered their crashed craft, some of which seem to be crashed because of our aggressive military interference with them, and some seem to have crashed on their own accord. We've recovered this craft, and we've reproduced their technology to various degrees, though it also seems that we've been able to create similar technology somewhat independent of reverse engineering. And as a result, many UFOs are actually ours. And this is a very fascinating claim. And that there's at least one secret space program, which means that these UFOs that are quote unquote ours, be they the US government's or Russia or China or so forth, that many of those UFOs that are quote, terrestrial, have the capacity to, go beyond the Earth's orbit, right? And go into quote unquote outer space. And that this essentially creates at least one breakaway civilization, meaning essentially kind of a group of people, a large number of people, hundreds of thousands, if not more, that are basically privy to this kind of, other life, this kind of, secret life, if you will, in some sense, who have access to the technologies associated with this. And that there has been a very successful disinformation campaign, and that the extreme taboo of the UFO topic reveals its truthful nature, which I've made that point a couple times today. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Like the stakes are very high, right? This disrupts our political system. This disrupts our economic system. You start talking about free energy and anti-gravity. This disrupts our religious systems in many respects. John Mack talked about the ontological shock of these realities being encountered and over time accepted as real for people, that it like just shocks your psychological system. So the stakes couldn't be higher, which is partly why there's such a taboo, because there's a lot at stake. The truth is stranger than science fiction, right? So it's stranger than fiction, and it's stranger than science fiction in many respects. Part of what makes it really fascinating is that UFOs are simultaneously extremely religious and spiritual in nature, and they're also intensely scientific and technological. And I think this is part of what makes it such a divisive topic, because currently on our planet, in our mainstream discourse, there's a deep opposition between science and religion in various forms, right? And in a way, this topic kind of forces us to reconcile that on some level. And lastly, there might not be a better catalyst for an integral world than the UFO ET phenomenon. So these are just some provocative statements to kind of give you a sense of some of the topics that are part of exo studies.